I started the day with many of you at the URP conference. It's great to be here this afternoon. My name is Jules Bruck. I'm the director of the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning. It's been a really great day, especially for those of you who attended the URP conference. And we're just so happy to see such a great turnout for this really important lecture. Before we get started and I introduce our speaker, I just want to thank a few very important people, including Alpa Nare, who is not here. She planned this whole event and she made sure all of the details were perfect for me. She didn't consult me unless it had to do with the budget. She did every single thing, and she had to go off and compete in a badminton tournament. So we miss her, but yes, she has great priorities, right? She is, we're rooting for her from the sidelines, and we're hoping that she wins her tournament. But really, if you know Alpa and you see Alpa, please thank her for all the hard work. We also want to thank our staff, who is typically pretty invisible behind the scenes, but we can't do any of this without our staff. We have Basil out there, and particularly Omar, our student worker, Bree and the Dean's office, who helps us with all of our events. So if you're staff and you're in here and I can't see you, so I didn't name you, just know, Ryan, thank you for waving, that we appreciate all that you do for us. So I also want to thank IT, who's been super helpful. And that includes Dr. Nick Serrano, who is part of our IT team and generally helping us in all directions. Also thanking the organizing committee for the URP conference that went on today. They are co-sponsoring our reception this evening, so we're really grateful for this collaboration. We're just so happy that this worked out, that we could blend these two events, the Ed Stone Lecture and the URP conference. In particular, I want to thank the Friends of Edward D. Stone Jr., and the Friends group is who made this endowed lecture possible for the Landscape Architecture program. The Friends of Ed Stone is still led by a really generous person named Dick Dickinson, who touches base with me frequently and keeps up with how we're doing with this lecture. He wasn't able to join us tonight, but we're particularly grateful for the Friends group and all of the people who've contributed to that foundation fund over time. It's an absolute privilege for me to welcome all of you here today. Over the years, our faculty has had the honor of being able to honor the memory of Edward D. Stone Jr., and he was really a trailblazer in landscape architecture, a global leader whose legacy still inspires landscape architects today, and again, a really wonderful person. He founded the firm EDSA, and that is in Fort Lauderdale. And that was back in 1960. He also taught at the University of Florida extensively, and that went on for several decades. This prestigious lecture serves to commemorate his numerous contributions to the field of landscape architecture. And so each year we get to the faculty selects somebody to come and deliver this lecture. And we have the great joy of looking for inspiring visionary leaders to come and speak on the behalf of Ed Stone's legacy. And tonight, we're really pleased to welcome Sierra Bainbridge, the co-founder and senior principal of Mass Design Group. You all are in for a treat. Sierra is a as I mentioned, founder and senior principal of Mass Design Group. She directs the Landscape Studio and the Abundant Futures Lab as well. I told Alpa I would read her bio, so I'm going to do my best, but I will make sure that we don't go on for too long because it's a quite extensive, lovely bio. She leads many of Mass's most complex and transformational projects across landscape, memorial, architectural, and land use design, from early work on the High Line and the Fresh Kills Park to more recent efforts like the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture and the Ellen DeGeneres campus of the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund. Her let's see, her projects reveal the power of design to catalyze ecological and societal abundance. This work has been recognized for design excellence, research and analysis, and sustainability by the AIA, ASLA, COTE, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Awards. Sierra also works to evolve the design professions through teaching and service. She served on the Landscape Architecture Foundation Board from 2019 and continues as board emeritus. She is the recipient of the Berkeley Rupp Prize for Career Achievement, supporting her ongoing design research on tipping points and planetary boundaries as practitioner in residence 2023 through 2025. She teaches landscape architecture and cross-disciplinary graduate studios and seminars at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and UC Berkeley, as well as the Boston Architectural College and the University of Rwanda. So many. Wonderful. And she also serves as the department head there. Sierra holds a dual master's degree in landscape architecture and architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in architectural history from Smith College. So with that, I'd like to welcome Sierra.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, good. Thank you so much. I also am very excited that you all had a conference today because I feel like the room is very full. Sometimes it's hard to get people in for these kinds of lectures. I love that it's on a Friday, so you can kind of relax. You don't have to worry about what's coming tomorrow. Usually these are on like a weekday, so hopefully all you students are feeling relaxed and excited to see what we have here today. Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here. My stepmom is from Florida. She grew up in Fort Myers and Miami. And then my parents lived in Bradenton until last year. And so I love driving here this morning from Jacksonville. It was a very Florida road and made me really happy. Especially it was quite early, so there was the morning mist and the beautiful loblolly, I'm guessing, pines plantations between here and Jacksonville. It was really lovely. So thanks for having me and the opportunity to come back to this beautiful landscape. I'm going to touch on a lot tonight, so I'm going to I might stop before the end of my presentation if I see anybody sleeping. So, you know, I'll try to be entertaining. But I want to think about, you know, how it is that we come to the work, especially because we have so many students in the room, but also how our practice is formed and how it's running currently. So I'm going to try to touch on a whole bunch of stuff, and hopefully it's interesting for everybody. The framing is Seeking Abundance. It's the title of our book, which has just come out in the past few months, or I don't know when, but sometime recently, and really focuses on 3 projects through which we learned about ways of not only activating community and economies through the work that we do, but also particularly how we work cross-disciplinarily to minimize the harm of construction and maximize the positive outcomes. Oh, I'm gonna make sure my screen is up. I think it went to sleep. I might do it without notes. Let's see. Will I do it? And my computer's decided it doesn't want to cooperate, so I'm gonna go noteless. I put this up because when I was in undergrad, getting that history bachelor's in architectural history, I took a couple of anthropology courses and I got really into it. And I would hang out in the bookstore and look through all of the books that were assigned for the upper level courses. And I got really into particularly James Clifford, who was thinking about what does it mean to actually go in and observe community and culture? And what are we bringing with us when we're doing that? And started to introduce this idea of reflexivity, which actually came out of sociology and then was embedded in postmodernism. But the idea that you actually can't come to a place or a people and think that you're observing it from an objective perspective. You bring with you all of your experience and all of the things that you've seen up until that moment. And acknowledging that history and that experience is part of what's going into that observation was a kind of key turning point in how anthropologists start to think about that. Just bringing that awareness and kind of being thinking about the possibility that might change the way that we understand the community that we're in, and trying to understand what we're creating within those communities, and bringing that critical consciousness. And part of that too is sharing. And so when we go in and have work with communities, one way that we have started that we like think about trust is that we're not just coming in and trying to understand what it is that a community wants, needs, what their experiences are. We also want to share of ourselves and that why are we here? What brings us to this project? And that begins because I think most all of us come to design with the intent to kind of be of service and use design to improve our lives, begins to generate a baseline of trust. And Marshall Gans, who leads a narrative institute at Harvard, also believes that in order to create change through and create movement building, you have to have some storytelling. And that storytelling for him is around this idea of story of me, story of us, and the story of now. And the story of me is, why am I here? Why is this important to me? What is my experience relative to the thing that I'm passionate about? Why the story of us is, why should that also be experienced? Like, why is that something that we all should care about? And the fact that probably what I'm experiencing, you've experienced something like that also. And the story of now is, why is this urgent? And, you know, for us, I start a lot of my studios this way. It's a great way to kind of get to know everyone else in the studio. But I think coming into a space and being open and sharing and trying to connect with people really jumpstarts the process of beginning to have a back and forth about what the vision of that place might be or that space. So I'm going to tell you my story of self, which I think is also interesting to students as they're trying to figure out where do they go from here. We continue our mother's stories and we begin our children's. I was born in 1973, and that was about 15, 20 years after the I-88 was integrated as part of the US federal system. It was authorized in 1968, so 12 years later, by the state of New York, and it was funded by the government. I was born in 73. And then in 1978, when they were beginning construction, Jimmy Carter signed an executive order saying that a minimum of 3% actually 6%, of people employed on federally funded projects needed to be women. And so it was this idea of just kind of creating space to bring women into different workforces. And my mom needed a job. She had just had a kid. She didn't have a degree yet. And so she went to SUNY Cobleskill actually, and took a course there and became an inspector on highways. And so growing up, I would go to site. This is I-88. I live in the tiny town of Hunter's Land, which we had like maybe 2 or 3 cars go up and down our road a day. It was extremely rural. She went to school in Cobleskill, and then this was the highway that was going in. And so this idea of this large-scale transformation of space was in my experience from a very young age. I went and drove bulldozers occasionally. I remember just being around these machines that were maybe 100 or more times bigger than me. And at the same time, we were like building our house. And so this idea that you can have some agency in the world around you was quite present for me. Being a burgeoning feminist as she was, she also put in Susan B. Anthony coins in every single bridge deck that she poured. And I'm excited to go back before they redo all those bridges and see if I can find any of those. I don't think it was an easy time for her, but I think she also really enjoyed the work. She had the job as an inspector of saying this paint is not thick enough, this concrete slump is not right, you have to go back and bring us back another load of concrete, the asphalt has the right temp, which is not an easy spot to be in as a woman in the 70s and early 80s. And even today, as I was researching this, I found that we only have 3% of women in the construction workforce across the United States. So the situation has not improved much. And I think the experience also in this research that I was digging into is that being on site is not necessarily much more inclusive or welcoming than it was 30, 40 years ago. I don't think that I wish I had a picture of my mom in a hard hat, but I don't. But I then I found mentors along the way. I did not want to be a landscape architect. I spent a lot as part of my undergrad. They had like a light studio at Smith, and I took those studios, and he brought in a landscape architect who worked on campuses. And I was like, campuses are really beautiful as they are. Like they don't really need that much help. I was also working on Nantucket Island in the summers to make money to pay for school. And it's a lot of money there. And I was like, they don't need more help with their landscapes. They're just fine. But I was really interested in how design could like transform space and improve people's lives. And so I was really like interested in housing. I was really interested in Samuel Moakby. He was able to come to Smith in my last year. I was able to spend the day with him. And then during an internship, I found in some research across the American landscape. And I took one course that was taught by some RISD professors from the Ian McHarg school. So RISD kind of took on that way of understanding how we design with nature. And then suddenly it all clicked. I was like, okay, we're engaging in processes. We're working on sites that are impacted by the larger region around them and also have the potential to impact sites around them. And we're working with processes. We're not working with something that's like frozen in time, but we're planting seeds. We're understanding how water runs. We're interfacing with these major forces in nature. I also met Anita in graduate school and has been helpful ever since. But that allowed me to, when I graduated from school, there really wasn't anyone doing architecture in the way that Samuel Moakby was as a practice. And so I went into landscape, which I love the materiality of. I think it's my true passion, and started to work on the High Line at field operations. I came on around schematic and then did the rest of the design process. And then I was able to do CA on the entire section 1. So I was walking the site every day. And I love this picture because I don't think my mom ever imagined, I think I hit escape, that I would end up on a bridge, making sure the contractors adhered to the directives, wearing a hard hat every day, but in a very different role and in a format and experience that was super, super exciting for me and super meaningful. And so I got to trace this project from the beginning with the removal of all of the kind of pioneer landscape that had settled there, watching all of and kind of working with the prep, which was the whole first phase of pulling it out, putting it back together, making sure it was waterproofed, then slowly installing all of the pavers, the railroad track. I was super excited and lucky to have going to all of the numbered track and figuring out how to put it all back together track by track so that it all made sense and where is it going to fit into the pavers, and then also working on the furnishing and a bunch of other things, and got to work with Pete Uldoff on the installation. And so it was really amazing experience. And coming at the very end of that, I started working with Maura Rockcastle, who was also on the project with me. We worked together every day on the High Line, and it was a kind of happenstance. Her fiance at the time was friends with Michael Murphy, and Michael Murphy was doing this hospital in Rwanda, which is the first project of mass. And he said, I think we need a landscape architect. Isn't that what your girlfriend does? And she knew that this is the kind of work that I wanted to do, was work that is in service of amazing organizations doing amazing things. So she invited me, and together we kind of alongside field ops started to do the work. And that relationship began when Michael went to a lecture at Harvard, and where Paul Farmer taught, and had read some of his books and went up and said, who is building your, sorry, let me back a little bit. Part of Partners in Health's approach is the understanding that health is not derived solely from the treatment of what ails a person at the moment of presentation in a healthcare system, but it is about all the other things that contribute to healthcare. So economic opportunity, education, clean water, housing, all of those things that help us to be healthy throughout our lives. And so they do a lot of provision of infrastructure and capital projects in order to support health. So they'll build housing. If housing is needed, they'll build like a room or space for meeting with patients of AIDS, which is something they started to do in a very innovative way early on in Haiti. And the idea of accompaniment was something that we learned early on working with Partners in Health, which is this idea that when a patient is being treated, you commit to them until they feel like they are healed and are not in need of you anymore. It's not a matter of kind of handing out this medication and then waiting and hoping that everything works. And so it's the accompanitor that helps us to understand when the task is finished or when the healing is complete. And that is something that applies to the way that they work from top to bottom. And it's something that we took on as a way of working and thinking of our role as accompagnators of projects and partners and helping them to understand and figure out what is it about design, which piece of it in particular can amplify the work that they're doing. And so our evolution of accompaniment, this is just a diagram. We often like look back and try to figure out what is it that we're doing and what are we thinking about next and what's working and what's not working. And so this is how our thinking about this has derived from some of the work of Partners in Health, how we experienced it on our first project. Some of our early design partners spent a summer and then a year on site working with clinicians every day to try to understand what is the best way to deliver healthcare at that time. But then moving into and like thinking about how do those things and how do those ways of working turn into tools and approaches that are really appropriate for design. And we are constantly, we often think of our practice as our longest running project. We're always asking ourselves what has changed, what hasn't, but should, what are we learning, and how are we sharing those lessons across the organization? And so just starting again with this project at Butaro Hospital, the approach was we spent a lot of time with clinicians to understand what the challenges were and what the opportunities were. And a big aspect of that was the reduction of airborne disease or airborne disease control, which we are now very, very familiar with. But at the time, no one was really thinking about the need for this in healthcare spaces. But it is much more urgent at the time in Africa because of the spread of tuberculosis in places like South Africa and other countries. It's global, obviously. But we wanted to use that as a design driver. Also, there isn't kind of not, at the time, the grid there was not super reliable and it was super dirty. All of the energy was coming in by truck from being shipped in across and trucked across Kenya. And so really utilizing natural light and ventilation. And so one of the big ideas was to like switch the beds and have everybody face the landscape, whether it was the garden on the inside or the hillsides of the place where all of the people who were coming to this hospital lived and worked. So every bed has a view, but it also consolidates the infrastructure. So everything that you need in order to like data, electricity, oxygen is you only have to run it once instead of around the entire edge of the room. It brings the windows much lower so you can let in a lot more light and really kind of structured the whole campus and made the landscape be one of the driving factors. All of the hallways are on the exterior. And Paul Farmer himself really didn't care that much about the architecture. I think he thought all this was cool, but every time he came to site, he'd be like, so where are my 5 fish ponds and how are the gardens looking? He himself is an avid gardener. And I think that need and desire and pressure to have the landscape be beautiful so that people, when they arrive at this place, know that they also are going to be taken care of in the same way that this campus is taken care of, really made this a part of our DNA. We are a cross-disciplinary firm. We have architecture, engineering, landscape, and we work together. And our best projects are when we are weaving those disciplines together from the very beginning and in very seamless ways. And so I think we started to think about and understand through this idea of being a nonprofit and how do we like hold ourselves to what kind of standards. And the idea of systemic change being a thing that we want to have in every project, that whatever we're doing, we want to ensure that whether it's a material shift that changes a market or a new way of providing healthcare that allows people more access, that we're trying to think about that larger systems change, which is another reason why we don't necessarily, we will work on any kind of project so long as we have a partner that is committed to that kind of change. And that opens up opportunities to create shifts across multiple typologies. So while we do healthcare and we'll continue to do healthcare, if someone came to us and really wanted to build the greenest skyscraper possible, we would totally be on board for that, like because it isn't really happening, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the methodology there is still like heavy HVAC, which isn't supported by the grid, et cetera. So we're a bit, we're fairly agnostic about the typology and really are just looking for the ways of maximizing impact with visionary partners. We also kind of came to the conclusion early on that design is never neutral. It either heals or hurts. And we can see that, especially when we broaden that and as we kind of, all of us as a kind of global understanding, but also through our design work, began to understand the pressures that architecture and the allied disciplines are putting on our landscapes. And so this kind of gains more and more potency as the years go by. And so we, again, designed for system change to improve the communities in which we live, to provide abundant futures for all species and awaken the links that bind us inextricably to one another. So I'm going to jump in a little bit to like how we're structured. We have 4 offices. Our oldest and largest office is in Kigali. So when I get back to that original story, I was finishing up the High Line. We had no one to build this hospital. The people who had designed it up till that point were all graduate students. They hadn't graduated yet. They started construction. No one had ever built anything. And I was just coming off the High Line, which is kind of like a building. It's not a landscape. It's not a building. But it's got a lot of systems. It was super complicated. And I was like, I can take some of this knowledge and certainly the knowledge of the CA process and how to maintain high standards and be on site. And so after phase 1 ended, I was like, I can either do phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, which kind of have a lot of similarity to phase 1, or I can go to Rwanda and try this whole other thing. And I was very interested in that. And so I moved there. I told field ops I was taking a leave of absence. I thought just to kind of soften the blow, I was a little concerned about leaving them because I had gained so much knowledge from the High Line. But once I got to Rwanda, I stayed there for 3 years. We built that project. We started a school, along many others, a school of architecture that the government had kind of gotten into motion but needed more people. And we have about 100-ish people in that office now, 80 to 100, it fluctuates. And it's still our biggest office. And many of the people who are in that office have graduated from that school of architecture, most of our principals, et cetera. Many of. And our second office was in Boston. We also have an office in Poughkeepsie and Santa Fe. And so I'm going to actually try to share one big project, one landscape project from each of those offices to get a kind of taste of how it is that we're trying to continue to take the learnings across our different entities. This is an old number. We're kind of like 120 right now. It really kind of fluctuates, as a lot of firms do, depending on the size of projects that we have and how many. We're continue to be interdisciplinary. We have film. We have, as I mentioned, the 3 architecture, landscape, and engineering. We've had anthropologists and epidemiologists, et cetera, and it really just depends on the projects in hand and the needs for those. And then we also are a nonprofit, and I'll come back to this. So we've partnered with 100 organizations in 20 countries, probably more, and that has led to our early work is intended to provide visioning and documentation and costs of projects so that our partner entities can then go raise the funds for those, and then we can help them continue to build projects. The 5th studio is landscape. That's us. We have 8 people currently. And we work across all the other offices. So we're the only one that's not geographically based. And again, we try to pick the projects that, alongside our other partners, have the biggest potential for impact. So I'm going to start with Kigali. Again, Christian Benamano was a TA when we first started the School of Architecture. Jean-Paul Sebuhayi graduated in our first class, is like amazing designer. And then we also have Anton and Adam Saltzman. This isn't a current listing of our principals and leadership there. It's shifting a lot. Adam moved to Madrid. We have other people coming up. And then these are a couple of the other projects. On the right is Norquin, which is a kind of entrepreneur hub, and then ALU, which is the African Leadership University. But the work there started with Butaro Doctors Housing, which was the idea of creating a place of like respite and beauty within walking distance of the hospital, so that doctors who are coming there to train, as well as the directors of the hospital, have a place to kind of go and recharge and then go back into the work. That followed quickly on with the Butaro Cancer Center of Excellence, and then the Oncology Support Center, which is a place for families to stay. It's one of the few rural ambulatory cancer treatment centers in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think Partners in Health and the government of Rwanda continuing to learn what it takes to support cancer treatment over time. And then after that, across on the hillside facing was the University of Global Health Equity. And so this campus was our first One Health campus. The donor for this project said, this must be a One Health campus. And at the time we said, we don't know what that is. But as we started to do the work, it is a kind of approach that comes from the principles of, comes and is based in veterinary and medicine, and really about the reduction of zoonotic disease transmission. And so the understanding is that ecology veterinary and medic and human health are all inextricably intertwined. And so this project, we kind of try to see the landscape and work with the partner to understand what does that mean from a medical perspective for a medical campus? How do doctors need to learn about how those other two areas are working of animal health and ecological health to support or detract from human health? And so it really kind of became an underpinning approach to our landscape work after that. And you see it on RICA and many other projects following and kind of in our overall ethos and approach to at most projects. And so this is just kind of how those projects began to spread out over the landscape. And we kind of began to see the possibilities of systemic change, of impact on policy that then would be able to impact not only this project, but other projects beyond the project that we're working on. And so we were able to do partial typical guidelines for healthcare in Rwanda, healthcare infrastructure, which they did not have until we started to work on these with the government. And that led to Manini District Hospital. There's Christian and Jean-Paul again. And then Nyarugenge District Hospital, and every time still trying to push. So this hospital looks kind of normal from the outside. It still has the same principles of exterior passageways. We try to never have interiorized passageways so that we can reduce disease transmission. But the thing that I love the most about this hospital is that all of the infill is earth block. We had submitted and tried to get, this was like our third or fourth time to submit and try to get a building built with earth block because it is seen in Rwanda as not a modern material and therefore not appropriate, particularly for a healthcare facility. But in fact, you obviously can build with compressed earth block in very modern ways. And so because this one now is a precedent, it means that many, many other healthcare entities can build with materials. So they're reducing emissions and able to use much more local and inexpensive material. And then that built also into our understanding of what was possible at the Rwanda Institute of Conservation Agriculture, probably the most well-known project for everybody. I'm actually not going to go through it today. I'm going to leave it. You can find a lot about it. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but want to kind of introduce you to some other projects that you might not have such easy access to information on. And that includes the Ellen DeGeneres campus of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. And so the book itself kind of starts with Alima, where it was like a 2-day motorbike and two days of flights to get into this site. Sorry, 6 hours of motorbike and 2 days of flights. And so it became very apparent when we went to kind of meet the community and understand what the needs were that all of our materials were going to have to be local, especially if the community would have any opportunity to either use those on their own homes and kind of be able to learn from the process or see if there's anything about what we were doing that they might want to apply to their own homes. Or have the possibility of maintenance. Up until then, they were using a lot of earth block, which is fine, but also like thatched roofs that there was constant repair of. And so we were trying to help think about different ways of using still local materials so that they could maintain their own buildings. And that was when it became apparent to us that actually you can build buildings with lots of materials from very close at hand. And so we tested that at RICA at scale. And then this came very soon after, or was actually simultaneous with RICA. And this one was really interesting to us from a learning of RICA, which was the ability to collect native plants on site and propagate them. And so for RICA, we propagated like 1 million. I always was saying like 500,000, but I learned recently that it was actually over 1 million plants that we propagated on a site, on nursery on site, and then planted. And so the challenge here was to think about how could we expand that even further? How could we be very intentional about the landscapes that we bring to this site and think about how they could kind of exponentially increase biodiversity? And does that work? And at what scale? And so this is in the very north of the country, very close. The gorilla habitat crosses over, Volcanoes National Park crosses over the border into Uganda. And Rwanda has experienced this tremendous shift of land use in a very short period. This is a global trend, but very obvious in this mapping. Everything that was green that has turned to white has transitioned over to farmland. So obviously there's just tremendous pressure on the few zones that are still green. And so this one up there is Virunga National Park. And so that kind of human animal interface is also becoming more and more pressurized. But as well, the ability of landscape to support agriculture is being reduced. And those two things actually work quite well together. There are a couple of villages that grew quickly alongside the same places that the gorilla gorilla populations were increasing and where they go to eat. And so there starts to be a lot of human interaction. And so, as mentioned here, the population is increasing, but only 5% of the primary forests remain, while the human population is increasing right up against that. And so Diane Fossey's thinking and the foundation really are kind of seeking to understand how it is that we can see the gorilla as very close to us. They share 97% of our DNA. I have to check that, 96.5, something like that, but very, very close. And when you learn about them, their kind of humanity is very endearing. And they're tremendously beautiful and interesting animals. And so the Fossey Foundation, their goal is to use this campus to make gorillas an entry point for a lifetime of activism. So how can you have people come and understand these amazing creatures and be inspired to be activists? I think focusing particularly on Rwandan and African community, but also bringing to anyone who's coming for tourism, et cetera. And they were housed at the time in this kind of nondescript building. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't anywhere near the forest. It didn't have any space to kind of share information about the work they were doing. And so they really wanted to create a new campus that could be educational and also serve as a place of research. And they really wanted to build it, or one of the things that came through in conversations with them was how unique and important it was for Diane to have built this space within the woods and have also this kind of immersion. And that was what led to this deep understanding of the gorilla. And so how do we recreate that and have people have that similar interface with the ecology that supports the gorilla? It was a agricultural landscape when we started with a lot of eucalyptus. Rwandans, when I started teaching there, I was like, eucalyptus is not native to Rwanda. And they were like, yes, it is. Because it was it's like everywhere. It is ubiquitous. Like no matter where you go, you see eucalyptus because it was brought in as a very fast growing tree that could be used for construction. It's used for charcoal. It's used for many things, but is also allopathic. It doesn't really support very much in terms of biodiversity and also really depletes water and fertility and doesn't really offer much back. And so this you can see it was cow pasture and potato fields. And we slowly began to transition it to this kind of experimental landscape, really thinking about how do we take the 5 different ecologies that the gorilla rely the most on and bring them down to this lower elevation, which is also innately a test of how these ecologies might do as we have very slowly creeping or rising temperatures. And so we can start to understand how different plant communities are going to respond to that. But it also will give us, there is an interest and there is a plan, and we also worked on this plan of expanding the buffer of the national park by 1 kilometer along its entire length, which is extremely exciting. And then also expansion of the habitat in certain like high pressure areas where where the families are really spending a lot of time and it's very close to their current boundary. And so there's also this question of like, what are different methodologies by which we can reforest those landscapes when they get turned over to habitat and wildlife use. And so we thought a lot about the buffer zone and One Health design and what might be coming later and how can this park contribute to that knowledge base. And so biodiversity restoration was a key aspect of this. It is super exciting to work with scientists because they know so much about things and they love to measure things, which is amazing because we rarely get money to go back and see if what we thought would work worked. And so to have scientists as partners means that the day that the thing opens, they start measuring and counting and looking for things. And so we worked with botanists, biologists, primatologists, ecologists to come up with this plant list that would, from all of the plants that fill in those 5 ecologies, which are the key communities that could attract the rest of the little floras and birds and faunas, mostly through like bird transfer, et cetera, and fill those communities in over time because we can't possibly plant all the things. And also is not necessarily sustainable if we want to think about other reforestation. And so they really helped us narrow these down to like maybe 10 or 15 species per ecology, which ended up being 126 native species. No one is growing native species at a nursery. And so again, we worked with local cooperatives. We told them what we wanted. They went into the forest. They got permission from the government to collect. And then we propagated here also over 360,000 plants, planted them on site. And all of that was to, again, create these tests, but also a heuristic campus, a campus where you could go on and learn, particularly for Rwandans who cannot access the park. It is crazy expensive. Like for a Westerner to go, I think it's like $2,000 now to go visit the gorillas. If you're local, it's much, much cheaper, but even $200 is really out of range for most. And so I think 78,000 students have visited since its opening. It's probably more today. And so it's an opportunity for them to kind of have access to a forest experience that they would not otherwise have. And it's growing a little bit at a time. It's coming, it's coming. And so we have an amphitheater for large gatherings. We have the gorilla habitat trail that helps us understand like which plants they use for bedding, what do they eat, et cetera, what kind of nutrition is provided by different zones. And then also the biodiversity trails, which take us through the other 5 ecologies and help us to understand them. We have a wetland trail also that they also wanted to have wetlands on site. And so that fed into a water treatment plan. So all of the water is treated on site through wetland treatment. But they also wanted, because they do a lot of measurement in the forest to understand the health of the forests, they wanted a lot of wetlands on site to train their scientists. So this whole site is also for training the scientists that are working in Uganda, Congo, and in Rwanda with gorillas and other primates. So this is what that started to look like. It also becomes a really beautiful, like all these frogs and amphibians move in. It has this amazing sound in the evening. It's quite an essential part of the campus now. And then we also had a section, we were going to build housing. We had to VE that, but then the landscape architects got space to do some reforestation plots. And so we tested 3 different types of reforestation, nucleation, Miyawaki, and then mixed forest. And then we also did a kind of hedge and thicket test that's right outside on the adjacent property. And kind of looking back and counting and seeing how those grew. The Miyawaki is crazy. We like win, and so far above, it's so dense. Like that density of planting is really impactful and works really well in tropical systems as well. But this is just an example of both like learning from students coming through site, but also how scientists are learning about how to measure and understand the health of campuses. So during the planting phases, this is what it all looked like as things were starting to get installed. And so you can kind of tell by the, I think the other pictures up front, this is not an object. Architecture here is not like a backdrop for landscape architecture isn't really a backdrop for the architecture. These are kind of not chaotic, but they are like wild landscapes. And it's really amazing also to have partners that understand landscape in that way. And so in 2 years of data collection, the presence of birds grew and diversified to include 52 species. There were species seen on site that haven't been seen in like over 10 years. They are counting amphibians and endemic salamanders, the Kirisimbi tree frog. All of these things came back to the campus within 18 months. To the extent that our main partner, Nse, who's a botanist, he was very skeptical. He's like, we can't do that much on this size of land. Like it's going to be better, but it's not going to be anything unexpected, and was totally, I think, pleasantly surprised and very surprised that you could do so much. And I think we're learning more and more. This was completed, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. But if you look at things like the Somerville pollinator plan, et cetera, like even a pot or a planter can have tremendous biodiversity impact. And so this is about 8 acres. And so in fact, we were able to have like a lot of increase of biodiversity. We have this theater that also gives you an experience of the gorillas. And then the other piece of this was working really closely. This is another project where we worked very closely with engineering and architecture to have this kind of seamless design approach. So particularly for engineering, all of these columns are not on a grid. The idea was that this is a kind of tent within the trees, and that the irregularity of the tree planting would blend directly in with the poles of the architecture. And as the forest grows in, you start to have this kind of seamless movement through the pathways, and the materiality of the pathways extend through the buildings, et cetera. We also decided to start a construction company, a nonprofit construction company, to build this, mainly because we wanted to maximize the amount of funding that was going directly back into the project. And so that 15% of profit, we were able to put towards all of the other exciting aspects that we maybe normally wouldn't be able to design, all the way down to the furniture, the plantings that we proposed, and the exhibits, et cetera. We also got to employ and train a lot of local team members who were interested in learning construction. 92% had less than 3 years experience, 32% had never worked on site before, and we provided certifications of formal training to over 600 workers. 23% were women, and 24% of the leadership positions were held by women. And the average percentage of women on construction sites typically is 11. At the same time, Rwanda is like notable globally as having a very kind of equitable leadership. Like their parliament has always been 50% or more leadership by women. So it was exciting to kind of try to see how far we could push the construction industry to meet up with that. The other thing that we learned from Partners in Health is that to make a change, you have to do a lot in one place. They don't come in and out like Doctors Without Borders. They work in 17 countries globally, and they start the work, but they stay forever. And eventually that team becomes a totally local team. It still continues to be supported by international expertise and training if needed. But the more you do in one place, the more you are contributing to electronic medical records and building hospitals and building health centers, the more you can uplift the entire system. And so I think that's also a learning that we had, is that if you want to kind of shift the way design, architecture, landscape is built in an impactful way and in a less destructive way, the more projects and opportunities you have to show that in one area, the larger impact you'll have on the market. And so that's something that we've brought into our work here. And it means that we try to position ourselves to do lots of projects in a place, which means we're not always chasing our RFPs from here and there, but we're trying to work with partners and people who want to invest in a certain place and then have those RFPs come out from those relationships. This is our Boston studio. These are our principals there, Jadi, Dave, and Jonathan. Our Boston, so Jadi is also the lead of the Public Memory and Memorials Lab, and if I have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit about that. David really has led lots of our healthcare work globally. He lived in Rwanda also with his family for about 4 years. And Jonathan Evans is our housing principal. And so our work there is really a lot of some healthcare, quite a bit of housing, and quite a bit of PMML work. But I want to walk quickly through the Embrace, which is the next major project that happened after the Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And so started working on this in the Boston Commons with Hank Willis Thomas. We won an award. It was a competition. We won. And then we realized that those who had held the competition didn't totally understand. They had approval to do something here, but they actually didn't have all the approvals. And in Boston, to build something in a kind of heritage space like the Commons, it took us another 1.5 to 2 years to just come up to finalize the design and then get it through all of those permitting processes, which the partner hadn't anticipated. And so eventually, though, we kind of got through all of that. It's an important place because it is, there's a place called the King Center, which really wants to create this pathway between this important location of one of Dr. King's speeches. They both were students in Boston for a period of time. And so there's a deep history between the Kings and Boston. And the King Center, and there's a pathway that's going to connect the King Center to this place. And so they really wanted to bring that presence of the Kings, and in particular, this Freedom Rally in 1965, which took place in this pavilion, which is within sight of the commemoration. The landscape piece is really about the paving pattern that supports this amazing sculpture from Hank Willis Thomas, and this idea that we are all together in this garment of destiny, with like our health and our success is mutual and interrelated, and represented that through this kind of quilted pattern, and the kind of quilted network of mutuality. This was kind of just understanding what other other commemorative pieces are, and this kind of in-between space that Hank Willis Thomas found that was between representational commemoration and abstract commemoration and memorialization. And a lot of people, when I first saw this, I was like, this is a really crazy looking thing. But I think that ability to evoke the feeling between these two people was what he was trying to do, that it's about this embrace and the love. This is a hug that was shared when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that kind of supportive relationship that they had that allowed for the work that they both pursued to happen. And so by abstracting it somewhat, but still having it be referential to that moment, was what he was looking for in terms of this experience of kind of love and support and moving through difficult times together. We also wanted to make sure that the local civil rights community was a part of this conversation, who've been working tirelessly for many, 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 many years. And so they're in the paving as well. And then we have there's like this idea of a ripple effect. And so the landscape grading as it moves out from this inner space is meant to represent the kind of potential change over time. But it serves as a gathering place for conversation, for events, for rallies, et cetera, in the area, and is right along the Freedom Trail. These are the other projects that are either completed or currently happening in Boston. And then we get to the Hudson Valley Studio. I have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go through a couple of projects really fast, but I want to make sure, I mean, I think the thing that excites me so much is to see how some of our learnings in Rwanda come into the United States, because I think it can be easy to say like, oh, that's easy to do there because there maybe are not as many restrictions, or it's not as litigious, or the kind of labor to material ratio is very different. But I think there are so many things that can be done here and are actually quite important to work in similar ways as we've worked there to create kind of like ownership and understanding of space and stewardship over time, et cetera. And so Poughkeepsie is one of these places that our team has also committed to. It was this really effervescent city at the turn of the century, but also received a lot of urban renewal funding in the middle of the century. And that really eviscerated the central area. It put in these really high-speed corridors that go through that are difficult to cross. It meant that the backs of the main street were like all of that building infrastructure that was there got removed and became parking. So this is just a listing, showing of all the parking lots that got installed. And it just became this kind of super fast thoroughfare and really eviscerated the economic center of the city. And this is not unique. This is obviously a story that we've heard before, but what we're calling the Fringe City is this third size of city. We have primary cities like New York City and LA and Boston, and they have lots of money and they can do lots of things. And you have secondary cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, and the others. And then you have third tier, which also received urban renewal funding, but have not received any since this time. And so they're still suffering from all of those implications. Generally, they're post-industrial. So there are lots of things that we put into this definition. They're small. And so they end up being these cities that you drive through that economically are, oh, did I do it again? What did I do? That are very challenged. Okay, good. And so the question is, if you can similarly like invest in many projects in one place, can you create a change over time? And so we're in our third or fourth or fifth project there now. And so it's still pretty early times. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Much appreciated. And so the question is, how do we invest in multiple projects? And the reason to do this is that a lot of these cities actually, because of their post-industrial setting, were situated along in corridors that are accessible to lots of other resources, but they tended to be oversized because they were supporting that industry, and now they've been emptied out. And so they actually have a lot of space to potentially receive climate migration if that happens over time, and would benefit from that. They also have as I mentioned, the possibility of like building in when we start to kind of localize resources again, can take advantage of that and have reinvigorated economies. And the hope is that some of our design decision making, where we decide to get our materials from, can start to also kind of jumpstart that economy. So these are all the both projects and landscapes that we're currently engaged in. It starts with a lot. I mean, part of the reason that we have many people who move there, particularly. We're not doing this from the distance of Boston, but we have a team that committed to this place. That's Chris Kroner, who's our kind of amazing engagement lead. And so many, many conversations. I mean, we're probably in the thousands now of conversations over the past many years, but projects are starting to happen. And so the Cistern was a project where we received funding, matching funding from the city and the Dyson Foundation to create a space of art installations throughout the summer. And then North Scenic Hudson is one of the biggest environmental groups in the Hudson Valley, and they've been doing environmental conservation for the past 50 plus years. They get a ton of money and they do a lot of amazing work, and they wanted to build their hub in Poughkeepsie for the similar reason of bringing a lot of kind of, I wouldn't call it gentrification, but economic revitalization that's happened in the Hudson Valley of people moving mainly from New York City and kind of bringing all of these small towns back to life, but it has completely jumped over Poughkeepsie. And so a lot of this is about how do you bring people in for art, for the ecological opportunities, and events spaces. And so some of the focus has been on those kinds of spaces. And the Fallkill Blueway is one project, which is to kind of use this similar to the Waller Creek approach. There's an amazing post-industrial river that is causing a lot of flooding. Our first project there was to actually help solve for flooding of a community center that housed like 10 or 12 social service organizations. And they said, we need to stop in Hurricane Irene, they got major flooding and had to kind of do a lot of reconstruction. They said, how do we keep this from happening again? So we started to look really closely at this creek and figuring out through engineering and daylighting and like cataloging, where are the walls too soft, where are they falling down, where are they too hard? How do we begin to mitigate the flooding that's beginning to increase over time? And how do we actually then use the work that has to go into these anyway to prevent flooding to create a community asset? And so that's my son right in the middle there, giving a lot of good input. But we had a storefront there, and so we had a ton of community engagement. We had a studio in 2016 with Columbia, and those students came up. We ended up hiring a bunch of them, and that's what kind of jump-started the office there. And spent a lot of time in the creek, spent a lot of time doing this engagement and really trying to think about how do we operate along its entire length, and how does it become both a mode of movement through the city, a place of access point to nature, ecology, education, and art, and how do you engage the different landowners along the entire length in the different ways that they're interested in. And so some of those prior projects like the trolley barn backs right up against this part of the city. And so one of the designs is to create like a stage there and a screen so they can have outdoor movies. And so really kind of working with each of those, both public and private entities, to find ways of creating this attractor into the city, and opportunity for a cultural life to kind of start there that would then hopefully impact well and draw people into the city and begin some of the economic revitalization. We submitted this like 5 times for grant funding from New York State. And finally last year, they got a on behalf of the city of Poughkeepsie, they got a $750 million grant. We had to RFP for that. So we did a ton of work to try to get this into being, but we still had to then win it because we're going through public processes. We luckily won it, and we just had our kickoff for that project like last week. So this has been like 6 years or more in the making. It's got to be more than that. But some of these projects take that amount of time, and that's what this kind of ability to kind of commit and have a nonprofit where we can bring in funding from all different kinds, and then see what we can start to have happen and create innovation within cities. And then I'll finally finish with Santa Fe, and I'm gonna go so fast, I'm gonna go so fast. I wanted to share this because it's a very early project, and so it reveals a little bit of our process. We don't know what this is gonna look like yet. We came in over budget, we usually do, and then we have to VE it down to the essence. But this is led by Joseph Kunkel, who a lot of our work out of Santa Fe came from merging with him and his organization, the Sustainable Native Communities Collective. He was spending so much time teaching and doing technical assistance that he had very little time to actually do design. And so we were like, let's just get together, we'll give you labor and you can do more. And so we merged with his office and have been growing that office ever since. And this project started earlier this year. And it's the Wind River, for some reason it's cut off a little bit, the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Center. We also won this through RFP, but part of the early process was to try to understand and hear from the team about buffalo as this really essential part of a lifeway that, to this quote, for this community, it was really hard to say where the animals ended and the human began. We kind of know the history of the buffalo being this kind of, and communities like this that actually had a lifestyle that was related to the migration of the buffalo, that all of the things that they utilized for their life ways had a relationship to the buffalo. And the buffalo also co-created the prairie. And so the question is, how do you start to bring the buffalo back to this landscape so that it can, both the landscape and the buffalo can be maintained into the future? And so this organization, along with a number of others, a number of other, both public and private tribal entities, are growing buffalo herds and beginning to think about how those can connect across very large landscapes and reintroduce migration. Like Glacier National Park is looking at having buffalo come back. We obviously know they're in Yellowstone, and this project is adjacent to Grand Teton in Yellowstone. And so I'm not going to read the quotes. You're reading them as I'm jabbering on about things. But part of our process is to use what we call the impact design methodology, which is a kind of theory of change approach that we adapted to design. But the idea that every project has to have a mission, and even sometimes if it's a big enough and complicated enough project, we'll have a landscape and an architectural mission. But this is to create a home for the new tribal-led model of buffalo rematriation. And so their goal is to not only have a place where they can bring artifacts that they're getting back into their community and have them be available for the community to interface with, but also do buffalo harvesting and processing, and also share all of this with the outside, with their community, but also with outsiders who are interested in what they're doing. And so this supports intergenerational stewardship of the buffalo, where knowledge is practiced, shared, and carried forward through lived relationship to the land, hoping to impact all generations who are visiting and participating, experiencing buffalo as the foundation of healthy land, resilient food systems, and community well-being. And the hope is that this can offer systemic change. Again, our hope is that every project that we do can affect projects beyond beyond our project. And so how does this offer like a demonstration of possible interface between community buffalo and tribes that can be taken up elsewhere? So this, again, it's like early. I'm not even putting in, like, we have so many, maybe 100 pages of research. So we do just all this deep research, the same thing that you all do, trying to understand the climate, the precipitation, the wind. In this case, the wind is really a huge driver of our design because they get this tremendous northwest wind constantly. And they harvest around once a month. And so you really want to create a space that can be not in the howling wind when they're doing this work. And so really looking at structures of windrows and berms, et cetera, and thinking about how those play into some of the landscape space that they want to have. We want to bring the prairie right up to the landscape, or to the building, but they also want to have an orchard. They also want to have an ethno-botanical garden and other things, but really trying to think about how the idea of berming and landscape protection for the building can make the inside and interior and exterior very livable and comfortable. And this additional research into like the buffalo itself, we really tried to understand them. Like, they eat differently than cattle. And the way that they eat supports biodiversity in a very different way than cattle. Their hoof prints are also a source of biodiversity. The way they press into the land, and then also, so we landed on these two things that are particular to the buffalo. These are called the, oh God, I'm going to forget the name now. The wallows. Sorry, I blank out sometimes when I'm super excited. So the way that buffalo behave actually is part of why they support biodiversity and why the plains and the buffalo are coexistent. And so the two aspects of that are their hoof prints, which are places where soil is trampled and aerated. They collect seed and disperse seed. Moisture comes into these moments, and it allows for plants to come up. And similarly on the wallows, where they use these dust baths to protect themselves from insects, social interaction, but also creates these water collection zones where when they leave, biodiversity or other plants kind of come in and fill in between seasons. And so we really wanted to think about those as drivers for the design, and that in some cases, architecture would take up that form, in some cases, landscape would take up that form. But that we're seeing it also as this place of the seeds of the future, of this kind of reconnection between the community and the buffalo and the landscape. And so how is this shape helping to kind of plant those seeds and support that interface? This is the one that came in a little high. And so we're in the process of VEing. I personally love VE. I know it's a crazy thing to say, but I do think that editing of projects is kind of key to an outcome from those that is brought to its most essential point. And sometimes without a budget that constrains us to that, we elaborate a little bit. And I think if we see VE in the right way, and we want it, part of the reason we always have to VE, I wouldn't say always, but we try to like achieve the biggest aspiration first and then work from there. We don't want the goal of the partner to be limited by the budget. And we confirm this early on. We're like, listen, do you want us to go for like budget, or do you want us to go for like the biggest possible vision? And so we tend to start there and see where we get, because many of the key things and bones that come into that early process can be maintained throughout the project, even if we start to winnow off other extraneous pieces. And so this is, again, this is just presented, I don't know, like a month ago, and we're really kind of working through these through the VE, and we'll learn where we land on this. But I wanted to kind of share a little bit about that early process. And then I'll end on the fact that we are a nonprofit, which means that we are about, it changes every year, this ratio. I think last year we're up to almost 40%. But we always are, like, part of our being nonprofit means that we can accept philanthropic funding. Sometimes it's restricted, and so our funder will tell us what we can use it for, whether it's for the organization or for very specific projects or types of projects. Or it can be unrestricted, and that is very hard to get, but we've been at this for a long time now, about 15 years. And so in year 5, 6, and 7, we started to receive unrestricted funding finally. Maybe it might have been a little later than that, which means that we can invest that within our organization in the way that we think is most impactful. And so sometimes it's in training team members that we might not have otherwise been able to have, or sometimes it's investing directly in projects that otherwise wouldn't have support, especially early phases. And this is going into a little bit, we have labs, and the labs are a way of like framing the work that we do that is trying to shift the work that's possible in the market to places where the market isn't yet serving. So the market, when we started the Deaf Space and Disability Justice Lab, there wasn't a lot of work happening there. PMML, like when we did EJI, there was not a lot of public memory work happening. And so trying to kind of get money funneled into places where design can serve, and it isn't yet, in order to open those markets up for everybody. And so I'm going to stop there. I think that's plenty. I was just going to talk a little bit more about the labs, but there's not really much content actually, and I'm about 5 minutes over. So thank you so much for everything. I don't know where to stop. I'll just leave it like on a fun picture like this one.
Sarah, that was just great. Thank you so much. I really want to give time for at least 1 or 2 questions before we let these good people eat and imbibe. So if there's a question from the audience, we have time for 1 or 2. Yeah.
Hi, Sierra. Thank you for all of your lectures today. I feel like I've been given inspiration to push me through the rest of the semester. I know you talked about it a little bit in this lecture about sourcing materials locally, and also earlier just about integrating material systems thinking like early on in the design process. Do you have any advice for the students in the room about how we can bring material systems thinking into our design process in studio?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I don't know that I don't think I included in this. Almost for every project, we have a materials mapping, because we try to start with what are materials are closest to the site, what materials are kind of endemic or part of the identity of the region, from everything from sand, which can be very hard to source, to gravel, particularly for landscape, what might you want to use, stone. So we kind of just do a deep inventory of all the possibilities. When we're thinking about architecture, we're even looking at, like, we did one project called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, which is one of my favorite projects, where they're a kind of farming innovation or an agricultural innovation hub. And so they work with new farmers to train, but also those farmers tend to want to test out novel methods. And so they're looking at de-risking farming so that kind of generational farmers from the Hudson Valley can continue their farming methodology. And also improve it so that they can kind of like have a chance against the kind of market forces that are very difficult. And so they, I think one of the thoughts was like, well, can you grow your building? Like, how might that look? And so we started to do a bunch of research on like, we looked at, I don't know, 3 different kinds of sheep and how much can you get from them every year, and how many years would you need, how many kinds of what sheep, how many sheep of what kind to get enough infill for the insulation for their first building, which was a shop building. And then we did the same thing for straw. How much space would you need to grow what kind of straw for what level of, what size of bale, and over how many years. We did it for bales, sheep, and a couple of others. And they ended up building their building out of straw bale, which is pretty cool, or at least some of the infill was straw bale. But I think, each project offers like very specific opportunities, but at the very least, like the closer you can get the ring of your material sourcing, the better. For so many reasons, like you're activating the local economy. One of the things that's super challenging is there's a company called Cold Spring. Don't put this online. But we're working with them for a project in Texas, and we selected a local marble, which is Sunset Red marble, which they built the Capitol out of, and actually a lot of, an amazing quarry, very much part of the identity of Austin. And so we were very intentional in selecting that, but they're sending everything up to Minnesota anyway to cut it because they have bought up all of the marble quarries through various parts of the country, and some of their tech is up there. And so it like is quite, it's a bit challenging the way material flows happen these days. And so sometimes you also have to try to activate like local masonry. And we were like, many times, like, can we get local masons for a piece of this? And are there any chunks of this project that actually can get carved here and don't have to go all the way to Minnesota to get CNC milled or whatever kind of things they do? So you kind of have to chase it down a little bit. You have to ask a lot of questions. Even in Rwanda, early on, we didn't know, we had just arrived and we hadn't really started to deeply understand all the material sourcing. And so this was like way back in 2011. It came to my attention that the wood that we were using on the columns for the hospital were being imported from Congo and taken from communities who weren't necessarily like able to sell that or able to like benefit from the loss of that timber. And so we after that, I said, we can't use any wood that we don't know where it came from. And so we will go on trips to visit places that say they have sustainable lumber and ask them a ton of questions. And it may not be like officially, FSC, but if they pass our sniff test, then we'll use it. And so we actually don't use a lot of, we ended up using for RICA and a lot of our projects in Rwanda when we use timber. We started working with the forestry department of Rwanda, and they have been managing plats of forest since the early part of the century. And so we worked with them to have their first graded kiln-dried timber. So our engineers worked to like figure out how to have a grading system. So sometimes you have to like push really hard. And materials reuse is also huge. And that I've talked to people like Julie Bargeman, it's Barge or Barge? Julie Barge of Dirt at UVA. She was one of the very first people to start like making really beautiful landscapes out of reused concrete and things like that. And you have to find sites where they want to get rid of stuff, and then you get it cheap, and then you have to find a contractor who's willing to do that, and you have to convince your partner that they got to spend a little bit of money to have something interesting, and hopefully you can make it. If you could get the right contractor, you can hopefully make it cost effective, but it's a lot of pushing. You got to push. Yep. You got one more question, right?
One more question. Well, we have time for one more question. Oh, Mark is the winner. You get next microphone.
To both of my knowledge, there are not very many nonprofits. Very inspiring representatives. Can you speak to some of the unique barriers, opportunities, and constraints operating at that model? Why do people are not nonprofit?
It's a good question. I think when we first, early on, when we decided, we were under the umbrella of Partners in Health. And we just had a conversation about this earlier, and I heard Alan, who's been our CFO like de facto since the very beginning. And the reason that we became a nonprofit and how that happened became revealed to me for the first time, which was that he was we were starting this work. We were working with Partners in Health, which is a healthcare nonprofit. And similarly, we're asking like, well, why is there a reason that we should also think about that as a structure for the work that we're doing? And he did an analysis in his professional practice class with another one of our like early collaborators, co-founders, and started to identify, and the terminal, and it was so cool to hear this today, parachute entities in healthcare that kind of come in, or in architecture like Shiguruban, like more like emergency response or type or disaster response, come in, create some pilots, and then they go. There also was a kind of precedent for Architecture for Humanity, AFH, but that's all based on like volunteer work. And the challenge with that is that you lose so much in like institutional knowledge, project knowledge. And we really wanted to have a way to support other nonprofits. And that's a lot easier to do if you're a nonprofit in some ways. Support other nonprofits in doing the work. And sorry, I totally just lost my train of thought. So we worked with Partners in Health, and I think the takeaway was that in reality, if you look at a lot of architecture firms, there's not like a really big profit margin. Like you could call most for-profit architecture firms not-for-profit architecture firms. And so like, why not have the ability to accept philanthropic funding? And so we had to go through a big process to like get kind of certified by the state and, you know, federally. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, but it does give you a lot more flexibility, which means that we can have funding to support stuff that the market is not supporting yet. And that is huge, I think, for the type of work that we want to be able to do. And yeah, and I think the other piece of it is that, to go back to the volunteerism, we wanted to be able to support, to show that a nonprofit structure can provide long-term careers for people when they start having kids, when they have family, elders to take care of, that the work that we do can kind of support the full kind of length of a career. And so far we have like many people who've been there from the very beginning. We have very little turnover. It's a great opportunity, and the work is quite meaningful. And I think the only like big difference is that when there is profit, it doesn't go into like the partners or people who are vested in the company. It goes directly back into the organization, and either it goes in as catalyst funding that we all together decide what we're going to spend it on, and that changes constantly, like our thinking about how to best do that. Or it goes into our like operations and upgrading, or like, you know, helping to support a new office or whatever that is. But we get to decide that all together, and what we're going for is like just enough, that we all have enough to like live a really fruitful life, but we don't need that much more than that in order. And so that allows us to have like really meaningful work, which is a really good balance. Like we don't really need more money. We just need more meaningful work. So yeah, I mean, we can talk more about like the other challenges, but so far it's worked nicely for us. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sierra. Let's have another huge round of applause.
You all looked very alert the whole time, so
Yeah.
thank you all for that.
I thought about it very, very quickly, and I'm sure everyone in here, Sierra spoke to you, because there were so many projects in so many places and so many different type of work. I saw our center staff, our Center for Landscape Conservation and Planning, faculty and staff nodding their heads vigorously, agreeing with many of things you were talking about relative to both the Gorilla Project and the Buffalo Project. Of course, all the different work and all the different scales. I'm sure it's sung to all of us. So thank you. And thank everyone for being here. I want to just give one last shout out to Ashwarya Shankar and the students who pinned up work. As you go ahead and get some happy hour food and drinks, please also come back in and see our student work. I'm sure they'd be happy if you find them to talk about the work that they're doing and the things that they're excited about, many of which are similar things to what we're talking about in Sierra's work. So thank you all so much. I just have a moment to present the Edstone plaque to Sierra.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wait, are you going to put this on your wall? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Wow, it's great.